A good day, all of you folks on the internet who are listening to this. My name is Jon VanderPloeg. I'm an attorney. I've been at that for 50 years, starting this year. I'm at the law firm of Hilber Hammond, South Counsel there. So I have time to do this sort of thing. And after 50 years of lawyering, you got to find some other things to do. I'm happy to say that this has been sponsored, and I'm grateful to the sponsorships by the Grand Rapids Historical Commission and the Grand Rapids City Archives. So I'm grateful to them for allowing me to do this. I'm going to talk to you today about the Republican Home Front and later the Citizens Action Committee versus Frank McKay, businessman and politician. That became a battle royal. Anyway, Frank McKay is often discussed. The truth about him remains elusive because he didn't keep a lot of records, or he kept records but kept them under wraps. He was a tireless businessman. He was tireless political operative, a political boss. And all of this was seemingly with one central purpose. He wanted to accumulate wealth. Political power was wielded for money. Money was wielded for political power. Often the means justified the ends, and that's about it. He was careful to the end. He worked behind and through others who did his bidding in exchange for patronage, payoffs, and votes. He was indicted 3 times on federal criminal charges, but was never convicted. We can find endless breadcrumb trails of his activities, his influence, and sometimes his absolute dominance of state and local politics. There's an early photo of him. He was born in 1883, raised on the west side of Grand Rapids. He first worked in furniture factories, but he exhibited great entrepreneurship early in his life. He catered to West Side immigrants with a bank and mortgages and housing that he built, some 400 houses. He amassed a grateful following, which he later exploited for votes. He also parlayed early patronage position as a Kent County Circuit Court appointment clerk into influence with important attorneys and people populating the halls of jurors. The system in Grand Rapids involved 2 high trial courts. There was the Superior Court of the City of Grand Rapids and the Kent County Circuit Court. He was in the Circuit Court, and crimes in the City of Grand Rapids had to be in the Superior Court. Crimes committed outside of the City of Grand Rapids were tried in the Circuit Court. And there was some, on civil matters, there was some forum shopping that attorneys could engage in, and he might have been somewhat influential in determining whether you wanted to go to the Circuit Court or not. He became the undisputed Republican boss of Michigan from the late 1920s until the late 1940s. He was the political boss of Grand Rapids into the 1950s. He became very wealthy. He said, "I am a businessman first and a politician second." He said that over and over again. I think those were sufficiently intertwined that I'm not sure which was first and second. In June 2021, Michigan History Magazine published this article by Chris Lyon called "Gangsterized Government, the 1940s Graft Scandal." The first sentence of that article starts with Frank McKay, blah, blah, blah. It focuses on McKay's head for business, becoming a millionaire and 2-time state treasurer in 1930. But then it says, here's one quote: "McKay often created opportunities within the government to further his business ventures, such as ensuring that all state vehicles were fitted with tires from General Tire Company, a company he founded. He also used his political influence to profit from distilleries." And it's an interesting episode because we always think of prohibition as creating a golden goose for gangsters and mobsters. But the decline and the end of prohibition brought on state regulation and the Michigan Liquor Control Commission and all the regulations. And McKay mastered that for money. McKay had been accused of crimes in the past before the 1940s, including mail fraud, extortion, and bribery, but conviction eluded him. Now, I might rephrase that and say, but he eluded conviction. However, by 1940, 3 grand jury investigations began to probe his affairs to some effect. Here are some prominent figures in his world as he came to be exposed and ultimately to crash. First, I want to mention Senator Warren Hooper, a Michigan State Senator from Albion. We'll talk about what happened to him more a little later. Kim Siegler. He was a lawyer. He was a flamboyant guy, said to be a dandyish clothes horse. He was a lawyer that was appointed special prosecutor, and he was the chief McKay protagonist. He sought prosecution of a lot of people who were involved in the graft and corruption, and found many convictions. But he hoped a high-profile prosecution of McKay would pave his way to the governorship and maybe ultimately to the White House. McKay slipped the conviction noose. Siegler did serve as a one-term governor of Michigan, 47 to 49, until he was swept out by G. Menon Soapy Williams. And I remember Soapy well on the Michigan Supreme Court sometime after he was governor. And I argued a couple of cases in front of him. Another major character here is Judge Leland Carr. He was a circuit judge, but he was appointed, I think, by the governor. Anyway, he was appointed to investigate all of this corruption, bribery, and skullduggery in Michigan politics. He's the one who hired Kim Siegler. Carr did issue numerous indictments, many resulting in convictions of politicians and law enforcement people. He was sometimes called Old Gravy Vest, I guess because he spilled gravy on his tie or whatever, or his vest. He was known to be a little bit disheveled, but a really good jurist. Another major player in all of this was the Sugar House Gang. They later became known as the Purple Gang. But here is a group mugshot of them in Detroit in 1928. Count 3 from the left, and that guy is Charles Leader. And he later, along with another Purple Gang member, Isidore Schwartz, became bodyguards and drivers for McKay in the 1930s. They performed a little bit more for McKay, not those two, but some other propaganda members, and we'll get into that. Another major figure, Willard Bill or Doc Vermeulen. He was a Grand Rapids dentist. In the late 30s, he conceived of the Republican Home Front. I say that early 1940s, but he got started on this as early as 37 or 38. He enlisted members to his home front who were committed to bringing down the McKay machine. I'll get into who they were later a little bit more. He said that it took them 14 years, but that they did bring down McKay. He said that in an interview in 1980 for the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum, Presidential Archives. Doc was as much a moral crusader as he was a political one, and he remains a bit controversial today for that reason, as maybe being too self-righteous. Another major player in this episode was Gerald R. Ford Jr. Ford's stepdad, Gerald R. Ford Sr., was an early member of the Home Fund, having been enlisted by Vermeulen and the others. And when Jerry came home from the war, he took his stepdad's place. His stepdad was very well respected, and both the senior Fords were very well respected in Grand Rapids. Jerry Ford Sr. said to Jerry Jr., if you want to get into Republican politics in Michigan, you better go see Frank McKay. Well, he tried that, and McKay left him sitting in his outside his office for 3 hours, and then gave him a few minutes and let him out of the office. Well, that spurred on the campaign in 1948 to get rid of McKay's guy in Congress, Barney Yankman. Now, here's about how McKay built the machine. He, as I already mentioned, he was the appointment clerk in the city hall. He had an immigrant following on the west side. He catered to them. And by 1940, through his manipulation of precinct delegates to the Republican Party, he controlled the Michigan delegation. I'll get into what he did with that in a few minutes. One of his enterprises was the General Tire Company. And there's a picture, or there's an ad from the Grand Rapids Press from the 1930s, and that tire store building is still there on Fulton Street Hill, just east of Jefferson as you start up the hill. After McKay left the state treasurer's office in 1930, a warehouse was found that contained obsolete and defective tires, all of which had been purchased by the state of Michigan. At the height of McKay's power as a Republican, he attended the 1940 National Convention with a Michigan delegation in his pocket. Senator VanderPloeg was there. He was kind of nosing around. He was talking to people. He was interested in maybe getting the Republican nomination for president. But McKay, who was probably no friend to VanderPloeg for a number of reasons, gave Michigan to Wendell Willkie. Willkie promised McKay that he could name federal people to federal patronage jobs and people for federal judicial appointments in Michigan. McKay took it, gave him the Michigan delegation, and VanderPloeg stayed in the Senate. Judge Carr's one-man grand jury with prosecutor Kim Sigler brought the hammer down. He issued many indictments against politicians, police, and gangsters, and obtained numerous convictions. Here's two members of the state police who came under the gun. Leslie Maycock, he had once advised other officers to stop a raid in progress on orders of the commissioner. And here's State Police Commissioner Oscar Olander. He was not charged, but Kim Sigler, as governor, asked him to resign, and he complied. So McKay was indicted 3 times on bribery, corruption, and fraud charges. He was never convicted. And I'll make reference here, you might look, get your Google machine going and look, Frank McKay, Downfall Dictionary, the Teflon Boss. And you'll come up with a pretty well-researched article about McKay, what he did, and how he was not convicted, everyone. But here's the big enchilada, Senator Warren G. Hooper. This came out of a horse racing bill and a bribery scandal. In 1940, a bill was introduced to deregulate horse racing. Now, that's fairly interesting because I have been told in the past, and I find no evidence of it other than what I was told, that in the alley from Pearl Street over to Lyon, the alley that runs next to the bar restaurant there, that there was a doorway about halfway along there that housed a pari-mutuel betting parlor for many years, and apparently it was exempt from police raid. Sometime later, a law was passed to prevent to prevent wire transfer of horse racing results. But anyway, Frank McKay and his buddy, boxing promoter from Benton Harbor, I think, Floyd Fitzsimmons, both favored the passage of this bill to deregulate horse racing. A number of bribes were offered and taken by state legislatures. Among them was Senator Warren Hooper from Albion. He testified that he was given and took $500 to favor the bill. In December 1944, warrants were served on McKay and Fitzsimmons for the grand jury probe of attempts to bribe a legislator. Hooper was to testify on January 14. This is 1944, I guess 1945. Well, anyway, he was to testify on a January 14 that he received a bribe from McKay. On January 11, he was found in his car on the side of his road, on the side of the road as on his route from Lansing to his home in his burning car with 3 bullets in his head. The stuff was big news. It was one of the biggest news stories of that year. This particular article names lobbyist Floyd Fitzsimmons and, quote, Grand Rapids politician Frank McKay, unquote, on grand jury charges of attempting to corrupt the legislature. There are many more articles. If you want to go digging around, you can find them. This book was published in 1987. 3 bullets sealed his lips. Rubenstein and Zewatz were historians at Michigan and Michigan State. They published the book. They did an intensive investigation, and they conclude that McKay was the guy who wanted the hit to take place, and that there was a conspiracy with $15,000, the payoff that used Purple Gang members who were in Michigan, in the Michigan prison in Jackson, Michigan Penitentiary. They were given a car and essentially a day's leave from the prison to go and carry out that task. Here's a picture, an evidence picture of Senator Hooper's hat post-assassination, and you can see the 3 bullet holes in the top of the hat. But Hooper was not the only witness who didn't get a chance to testify against McKay. Harry Bilinga, the vice president of Star Transfer Company, a trucking company, was called to testify. And I think that was on liquor graft charges. But before he could do so, he was killed when his car was struck by a train. Kind of hard to figure out how that might have been engineered by anybody, much less by McKay, but that's what happened, and it's pretty weird. State Senator Earl Mumshaw was to testify against McKay, but before he could do so, he was found dead in his running vehicle in his closed garage. So the Republican home front. Willard, Dr. Buellin, conceived of it. He first enlisted Paul Goebel. There was a very snowy day, and most of his patients had called in to say they couldn't make it. And he went to just chat with Paul Goebel at Goebel's sporting goods store. It was Goebel and Brown at the time. And Jerry Ford, fresh out of law school, happened to come in and hear the conversation, and they talked to him. And Ford said, well, count me in. This is before he went off to war. He said, count me in. And Vermeulen said to him, well, you got to be careful. You're a young lawyer and you may lose clients. And he said, I'm brand new out of law school, brand new practice. I've got an office, but I don't have any clients, so I'm not worried. They recruited 8 more people. They were all well respected in the community with impeccable integrity and their own businesses to keep them out of the, so that whatever business they might have worked for wouldn't want to influence them not to be involved. They wanted to be immunized from the machine. Here's a front or a full page ad that was in the Grand Rapids Press, advertising the Republican home front, telling what it was up to, and listing the people who were signed on. And what's interesting to me as a guy with Dutch heritage is there was only one Hollander. And the Hollanders pretty much stayed out of politics through that time. They were more in line with we want morality, but they didn't want to get involved in the politics, the machine at all. But one of the people on here is Claude Behrens. Now, Claude Behrens was my father's uncle on his mother's side. And Claude owned a grocery store on Chicago Drive, not far. You go down Granville Avenue, you go down the hill and make the curve out toward Granville, and it becomes Chicago Drive. And right along there, Claude Behrens owned a grocery store. But he started an insurance business in the back of the grocery store. And apparently by this time in the 40s, he was probably doing very well and very well respected. Now, over the years, that insurance business became a very big one in Granville, and it still exists today. Vermeulen was motivated, inspired, I'd say, and really angered by 2 things. One was a friend who had a sister in the Grand Rapids Sanitarium that was run by a doctor who wholly neglected the care of his patients. It was said that he was a heavy drinker, and he was not caring for patients, including this patient's sister. Vermeulen said, take her out of there and get proper treatment. He did. She had surgery that saved her life. Vermeulen viewed this as utter neglect that came from the sanitarium doctor who was a product of, quote, the machine. He also had a patient who worked for McKay, and he developed loose lips. Constantine Teeny Daniels. And Vermeulen said, well, what do you do for McKay? He said, I'm sort of a personnel man. He said his job was to find everyone's price and whether they were worth it. Now, in the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library, there are 3 transcribed interviews from 1980 by Dr. Thomas Soaps. They were Willard Vermeulen, Paul and Margaret Goebel, and Dorothy Judd, and we'll get into her in just a couple of minutes. But he focused in all of those on Frank McKay. Dorothy Judd said, I thought you wanted to come and talk about Gerald Ford. She said, but if you want to talk about Frank McKay, I'll talk about that. And she did. Starting in 1942, the Republican Party began to beat McKay at his own game. They put up an anti-McKay list of Republican precinct delegates. With hard work and dedication over a couple election cycles, they took the party away from McKay. And in 1948, they promoted the Republican home front, promoted Gerald Ford for Congress against Barney Yankman, who was McKay's man in Congress for 8 years. So the 1948 congressional race, a lot of work went into it, a lot of hard work, persistence, courage. McKay lost big. The winner, here are Jerry and Betty leaving their wedding at Grace Episcopal Church in October 1948. Interesting. He won the Republican primary, which meant he was a shoe-in to Congress in the general election. general election would have been in November 1948, and they celebrated before the general election by getting married. Two losers, Barney Yankman, and there's a picture of his house on Franklin Street near East Grand Rapids. Actually, there's three losers, because the other big loser was Frank McKay. But this curious photo over here, taken in the interior of the Horseshoe Bar, there's the Democratic candidate sitting on the far right, Fred Barr. So what's this all about? My good friend Kim Rush found this for sale on eBay without a single explanation, but he recognized the man in the middle as Frank Lamar, the owner of the Horseshoe Bar and the Lamar Hotel upstairs from it, and that it was taken in the interior of the Horseshoe Bar. Why are these gentlemen posed there? Why the photo? And Kim didn't know who the fellows were on either side, but he knew who Frank Lamar was. And I didn't recognize on the right Fred Barr. I had met Fred Barr a number of times as a kid at the Civic Auditorium. He became the manager of the Civic Auditorium, but he always dabbled in politics. And he ran as the Democratic candidate against Jerry Ford in the 1948 congressional election. I suspect this is indicative of McKay making a last-ditch effort to beat Jerry Ford, and by getting votes from Lamar and so-called vice precincts, and that this was a little electioneering going on there at the Horseshoe Bar. Anyway, that's Fred Barr, and I didn't recognize him because he lost a lot of weight after that, because his health had really suffered from his excess weight. And I asked my mother, who's this guy? She said, well, that's Fred Barr. Sure enough, she was right. So the late 1940s and into the 1950s, there was a lot of post-war public sentiment to clean up this town, to root out graft and corruption in City Hall. There was an effort to clean up vice, gambling, prostitution, and illegal liquor. The illegal liquor was generally after-hour sales. And there was a belief that McKay's stranglehold on the Republican Party, though it was broken, he still had a machine in City Hall from which he benefited. There was still trading of mutual favors, and McKay still had sway to control votes from certain precincts. And I have some personal knowledge of that I'll get into. Vice, it was said in some quarters that Grand Rapids was a wide open town in the 1940s. And the reformers, which now included Hollanders, wanted to crack down on vice. And most of the reformers believed with good cause that vice was supported and protected by McKay and his political and police cronies. Doc Vermeulen said that they could never get any support for their movement from these so-called, quote, vice precincts. Reformers believed that Mayor Welch was in league with McKay, who dictated the protection for vice business in exchange for votes. McKay published his own weekly newspaper, the Michigan Times, and he used it as a bullhorn for his version of events in auditoriums. He quarreled with Vermeulen in print over the existence of prostitution in Grand Rapids. He challenged the doc to provide evidence. Well, it openly existed in several houses, at least on Ionia downtown, and they were apparently immune from vice raids. Enter Citizens Action and Dorothy Leonard Judd. She devoted 70 years of activism, battling corruption, graft, and bossism. Fought for civil service reform in Michigan and Grand Rapids. She joined the League of Women Voters in 1919 and was eventually president, I think, of the Michigan League of Women Voters. But she said in her 1980 interview for Dr. Soaps that her organization started investigating McKay beginning in the late 20s, and then they started investigating George Welch in the 30s. Now, Welch is, boy, you can go either way on George Welch. He had, well, here's what she said. He had some good ideas about the handling of relief, but everybody was suspicious that McKay was profiting by it. She brought her fight against Welch in the early 30s. A project that Welch started and finished was the Civic Auditorium. And workers who were, men out of work were hired to do that, but they were paid Grand Rapids scrip. Scrip could be used to purchase groceries at a Grand Rapids grocery store. People were suspicious that McKay was getting money out of that whole arrangement. In 1949, she and a lot of others were upset over the Welch administration in City Hall, so they organized citizens' action. The city was in need of more money, so someone started looking into the tax system. The city assessor was appointed by the city commission, and the job always went to a McKay man, whether he was qualified or not. But he also gave massively low values to certain people who were favored by McKay. Low value, lower the value of the assessment, the lower the taxes. So Judd's group obtained amendment of the city charter to have a professional appraiser appointed by the city manager. That caused a great furor with Welch and McKay. That came to an explosive head in 1949. At a city commission meeting, city manager Frank Goebel, who was brother of Paul Goebel, announced appointment of a professional appraiser at a city commission meeting with a packed audience. Mayor Welch went into a rage. He fired Goebel on the spot, and according to Judd, he physically chased him down the aisle and out of the hall. Well, Judd and several hundred others went off to various officers where they somehow all agreed to a mass meeting at the Fulton Street Park with speakers to rally against Welch and McKay. Speakers included her, and one other that of note was Duncan Littlefair from Fulton Street Church. Well, the citizen action became a movement across the state, not only Grand Rapids, but also Detroit, Kalamazoo, and Flint. By the late 1940s, McKay's stranglehold on the Michigan Republican Party was at an end. And in Grand Rapids, with the recalled juggernaut headed his way, Mayor Welch resigned in 1949. Now, the city leadership changed hands several times in the 1950s. There was a battle between reformers and, I guess, other than reformers, on the old guard. The mayorship changed among Paul Goebel, George Veldman. George was only in there for a couple of years, and he was kind of a placeholder. Stanley Davis, and the loser in 1958, Louis DeCorn. DeCorn ran as a reformer. According to my father passed along a little dirt on DeCorn, which I won't repeat here because I'm a lawyer. Anyway, Louis DeCorn ran as the reformer against Davis. The Grand Rapids Herald came out in favor of Louis DeCorn, said, Monday, you go vote. You vote for Louis DeCorn. He didn't win. There was a lot of pressure in the 1950s to stamp out vice, gambling, and prostitution. Captain Walter Coe, a black police captain of Grand Rapids Police, he had been the first black patrolman ever hired by the Grand Rapids Police, and he became ultimately a police captain. It is said often that he had complete control of policing the vice precincts. A lot of good is said about him. Some say that he manipulated, he kept a lid on things at the behest of the white power structure. When I asked my mother in the last decade about him, she said, oh, he was highly respected. She repeated, highly respected. And he died in 1957 of a heart attack. And things kind of went out of control for a while after that. Now, in the 1950s, there were numerous vice squad raids. That picture of slot machines is taken from a bridge over the Grand River, where my father, an assistant prosecutor there on the left, and another assistant prosecutor are heaving them into the river. At least that's what I was told was happening there. That's a Grand Rapids press photo, but I don't find that it ever made it into the press. When my father was elected judge of the Grand Rapids Superior Court, starting in 1960, press reporter James Mudge did a nice biographical piece on him. And here's what one of the things he says in there. Goodness, I set it aside. Okay, here. He says, as a hard-hitting assistant prosecutor, Judge VanderPloeg set some sort of record in making raids with police officers. These were days of quick breaking, massive swoop downs on vice, when doors were smashed and sledgehammer attacks were made on gambling. Well, I find articles that show that they weren't always successful. And I will just, about gambling, one of the premier gamblers in those days was Ted Raspberry. That has a very good record for assisting youth baseball in Grand Rapids. He was a very enterprising fellow. And in 1960, he had been arrested on a numbers racket. And my father sentenced him to the heaviest fine that he could give him. And lectured him there, saying, you're a well-educated and very smart fellow. Why don't you use that for the good of your community? So that's what he said. But sometime after that, I was walking through Myers in the evening as a young teen with my father, and we came upon Ted Raspberry walking in the opposite direction. And they stopped and they chatted for a moment. I remember, hi, Ted, hi, Judge. And then we all went our separate ways, and I'm walking along with my father, and he said, he runs all the gambling in Grand Rapids. Now, Raspberry was arrested again in 63 and a massive gambling bust. And I don't know what came of that. But anyway, there was a massive attack on gambling and prostitution. When my father was running for judge in 1959, he went to a Republican monthly meeting where he was to speak about his campaign. And somebody asked him, according to my mother told me this in the last few years, somebody asked, well, Claude, if you're elected judge, do you promise that you will send all convicted prostitutes to the Detroit House of Correction? And he told my mother that they wanted that to get them out of town, and that they would be sentenced to no less than a year if they were sentenced to the Detroit House of Correction. And his reply was, I can't promise anything on sentencing. It's all case by case. And he came home and said to my mother, he said, I've lost the Republican Party. So he endeavored to get other support, and he went to his friend Stan Davis and said, Stan, can you go door to door on the west side and get me the necessary votes to get elected? And Stan said, I can't do it because I got to stay nonpartisan, but my wife can do it. And she did. And so my dad got enough votes out of the west side, more than any other Hollander before that, to get elected. So So anyway, let's get to the last chapter here. Where did McKay go? Here's the last chapter, and I say it's a doozy, and I think so. McKay's influence, even in Grand Rapids, was so diluted. Oh, let me just return to that Frank McKay story and my dad getting elected. So one time I said in the last decade, and my mother died at age 98 a couple of years ago, I said to her, I think Dad, when he got that help from the West Side, I think he had to go and get some help from the remnants of the McKay machine. She said he would have nothing to do with Frank McKay. She hesitated. And then she said, oh, but I do remember going to a cocktail party at the mayor's house. And that would have been Davis. And Frank McKay was there. And I said, oh, what did you think of him? She said, I just thought he was an old man. So by the end of the 50s, McKay was kind of persona non grata in Grand Rapids. So where did he go? What did he do? He went to Miami Beach. McKay built the Bal Harbor Hotel, and there's a postcard for it on Miami Beach. And it's reported in newspapers that it was a $2 million to $2.2 million project. It was reported that that there was a corporation, and he was the major stockholder and the treasurer. But it was in the name of some other folks. There was a newspaper article, I can't remember which paper it was, I think from Indianapolis, that's reported on the hotel and its construction and saying it was being built by Frank McKay, quote, an Indianapolis businessman. So what's all that? I think that's about him just keeping his tracks covered. Now, this hotel was the site of the 1957 Teamsters Convention, where Jimmy Hoffa ascended to the presidency of the Union. And it's depicted in the movie The Irishman. And I found this badge for Jimmy Hoffa. I'm a friend of Jimmy Hoffa. So my question is, was McKay a friend of Jimmy Hoffa? You got to follow the breadcrumbs here. Why would he build a hotel in Bal Harbor? That's where the AFL executive committee had their annual conference starting in 1951 at the Sheraton. The AFL-CIO formed in 1955, and the Teamsters were within the AFL-CIO. Meetings at Bal Harbor Sheraton were subject to frequent criticisms, including labor disputes at the hotel. So Hoffa and McKay and Teamsters may have been looking for some alternative. I'm wondering whether McKay, for example, looks to the Teamsters pension fund piggy bank to build that hotel. Don't know. Just kind of looking at all the stuff that was going on at the time, and we know that was one thing. So here's McKay's last play, and I don't know if anybody else knows this, but the person who told it to me, and I'm not going to tell you who told me this. It's unimpeachable. I'm just going to rely on it as being unimpeachable. I don't know if I have permission to tell you who told me this. It's unimpeachable. Enter El Presidente Fulgencio Batista, Cuba. McKay made a deal with Batista to partner in the construction and the ownership of a casino in Havana. To commemorate that, Batista gave McKay a ring that he had fashioned that had a stone in the middle and Batista's initials on one side and Frank McKay's initials on the other side. Now, consistent with that, McKay sold the Bal Harbor Hotel in 1959, but he kept a penthouse there. Now, how did that come about? I don't have anything more than, okay, there was this deal and it was commemorated by this ring. If you read this book, Havana Nocturne by historian T.J. English, who's a very good writer, very good researcher, very good writer, kind of a page turner. It's subtitled How the Mob Owned Cuba and Then Lost to the Revolution. You get how this all came about in Cuba. The mob. It's in the movie about The Godfather 2. And the deal with Batista, if that happened, must have been brokered by Meyer Lansky and or other mobsters who owned Cuba. They made the deals with Batista. Batista made the deals with them. They were bringing in as much capital as they could to build essentially a mob empire in the Caribbean, centered in Havana. No question about it. And it was all open and notorious. So did McKay go there at their invitation? Did he perhaps have capital that came from the Teamsters Pension Fund? I don't know. I'm just putting together breadcrumbs. But I'm assuming the McKay-Batista casino deal went up in smoke because of this guy, Fidel Castro. McKay's final scheme stopped there. Batista failed to deliver on his end of the bargain. The mob had pushed all their chips into the middle of the table, betting on Cuba and Havana and the rest of the Caribbean. They relied on Batista to contain and put down the revolution. Batista failed. That was the end of it. And as English put it, they lost. They owned Cuba and lost it to the revolution. So that's the end. And McKay died in 65. He was 81, 82, I think. But anyways, and he didn't get buried in Florida. He's in the cemetery on the west side in that crypt that I showed you at the very beginning. So what are the lessons here? We all find history interesting to provide context for where we find ourselves today. But it's also kind of a voyeuristic kind of thing. We enjoy learning these things because they're intriguing, merely intriguing. But this story, like so many others, does give us lessons that might guide our behaviors. One, I think, is this: all politics are local. We always hear that said, but it's true in two different ways. I'm going to go to the second first. Voters ought to be met where they live, at home and around the dinner table. That's what compels their vote one way or another. But that political organization then should start at the ground and work up, not at the top and work down. And McKay understood that completely. He took over precincts by precinct delegate by precinct delegate. And precinct delegates are elected at county convention. I'm not even sure how that's done today. So watch out for this, because I'm going to just go to something that was in the news just this weekend. And I'm not saying this from a partisan standpoint. I'm just saying it from, hey, look what some people want to do and judge it for yourselves. Because it came out this weekend that some in the Republican Party are looking at eliminating Republican voter voting for nominations, primaries, Republican primaries. They're looking at eliminating Republican voter primaries and going to a caucus system. Who would caucus? Not voters, only precinct delegates. So I'm just saying, somebody's thinking here about starting at the ground up and not at the top down. So watch for it. look at the lesson we learned from Frank McKay and his machine. All right, thank you very much. If you have any questions, maybe get a hold of me somehow. But that's the end of the presentation. And thank you once again.